Life after the funeral. I didn't know why I was there. It wasn't like we were close. I hadn't spoken to Kevin in over 5 years, and even then, it wasn't like we'd been close friends. More like old acquaintances whose paths crossed once, a long time ago, and then faded into nothing. But when the invitation arrived, I felt, well, something. It was a sense of obligation, maybe. Or just the weight of an unspoken connection that neither of us had acknowledged. I didn't even know who to call when I got the notice. No family to speak of, no close friends left. Just a few names on a list, reminders of people who had once filled the background of my life. The funeral itself was a blur. There were maybe 10 people there, not even a dozen. Most of them looked just as confused as I felt. There was the strange awkwardness that you always get at these things, the half-hearted conversations, the polite, but distant smiles, as though we were all there because we had to be, not because we wanted to. I stood by the casket, watching the ritual unfold, staring at the polished wood, the lilies, the urn that now held what used to be Kevin. I wondered if it would have been any different if I hadn't come. Would they have missed me, or would I have been just another nameless face in the crowd? But that was the thing with funerals, wasn't it? They weren't for the dead. They were for the living. They were for those left behind, those who had to wrestle with memories and regrets, trying to make sense of things that didn't make sense. And so, there I stood, a silent witness to someone else's closure, someone else's grief. The thing is, you never really expect anything strange to happen at a funeral. You expect the grief, the sadness, the silence. But what I didn't expect, not in a million years, was what came next. When I got home that night, my phone buzzed. Just a message, nothing unusual. But when I checked it, my heart skipped a beat. It was from Kevin's number. "Why did you come? I'm not dead." The words on the screen didn't make sense. I stared at them, blinking, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I tried to laugh it off. It had to be some sick joke. Maybe a prank from someone who knew I had been there. Maybe a wrong number. But no. There was something about it, something that I couldn't shake off. I clicked on the message and tried to delete it. But before I could, the phone buzzed again. "Why did you come? I'm not dead." And then another message. And another. Panic began to crawl up my spine. My fingers shook as I turned the phone off, but it didn't help. The notifications kept coming. Every time I powered the phone back on, there they were, flooding the screen with those same words. My hands trembled as I tried to swipe them away. It's just a glitch, I told myself. It's just some freaky malfunction. A bug in the system. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something too real about it, something that didn't belong. And then, the call started. It was his number again. Kevin's number. Ringing. Just ringing, and ringing, and ringing. I could feel the sweat collecting on the back of my neck, my stomach twisting into knots. I answered it, hesitated, but there was no voice on the other end. Only static. The kind of static that made your skin crawl, like something was trying to break through, something that didn't belong on the other side of the line. I hung up, my heart racing. I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. No surprise there. But I knew something was wrong. And then the worst part came. The next morning, I went out to pick up some coffee, my mind still reeling from the night before. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the street as I walked. The air was cold, biting, and I tried to ignore the feeling of dread gnawing at my insides. But then I saw him. Kevin. He was standing across the street, just standing there, watching me. At first, I thought I was seeing things. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe my mind was playing games with me. But no. He was there, in the same clothes he had worn to the funeral. His hair was messy, and his face, it was wrong. His eyes, or where his eyes should have been, were empty. Hollow. His face was gaunt, his skin too pale, and there was something unsettling about the way he stood, unmoving, his gaze fixed on me like he knew something I didn't. I froze, rooted to the spot. My breath caught in my throat. It was him, but it wasn't. His eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, drilled into me as if he could see straight through me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet felt like they were cemented to the ground. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to make my blood run cold, then turned and walked away. Slowly, deliberately, like he knew I would follow. Like he knew I had no choice but to look. And then he was gone, swallowed by the streets, swallowed by the city. But I couldn't forget those eyes. I couldn't forget the way he stared at me. I ran back to my apartment, my heart pounding in my chest, every nerve screaming at me to get inside, to lock the door, to shut it all out. But the moment I stepped through the threshold, my phone buzzed again. "Why did you come? I'm not dead." The message flashed on the screen, as if to mock me, and I knew that whatever was happening, whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not yet. And it was only going to get worse. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the phone, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. I must have been in shock, that's the only explanation. My mind was scrambling to find a logical explanation for all of it. Maybe it was some sick joke, maybe some prank from a twisted soul who knew exactly how to get to me. But no. The feeling gnawed at me, the same gnawing that had started when I saw Kevin on the street, his eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, watching me. I wanted to reach out to someone. But who? I had no one. The few friends I used to have had faded away years ago, and the rest of my family, well, let's just say they weren't exactly in the picture anymore. So, I did the only thing I could think of, I called the number. Kevin's number. Maybe, just maybe, this was all a mistake. Maybe I could finally get some kind of answer. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The line clicked after the first ring, and then I heard breathing. Heavy, shallow, ragged breaths, like someone was right there, just inches away from me. My pulse raced. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth felt dry, my thoughts scattered. Kevin? I whispered, my voice barely audible, a tremor I couldn't hide in it. There was no answer. Just the breathing. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice gaining a little strength. This isn't funny. But it wasn't funny. Nothing about this was funny. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. I held my breath, waiting, praying for some kind of response. And then, a voice. A voice that made my blood run cold. You shouldn't have come, it said. The voice was raw, rasping, as though it hadn't been used in years. I told you I'm not dead. But you didn't listen. You never listen. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hands trembling, the message from earlier still haunting me. Why did you come? I'm not dead. Was this really happening? Was I losing my mind? Was this all a figment of my imagination? No. No, it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. The strange part, the part one couldn't shake, was how real it all felt. The emptiness in his eyes. The way he stood there on the street, watching me. The coldness of his gaze. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. And yet, I couldn't escape it. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kevin, standing there, his hollow eyes staring right into my soul. The weight of it was suffocating. It felt like I was being slowly crushed under something far heavier than I could understand. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know what was going on. So, I made up my mind, I was going to go to the funeral home. I had to. If there was any chance of figuring out what the hell was happening, it would start there. I drove through the city, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I didn't know what I expected to find. But when I arrived, the place was quiet, eerily so. It looked the same as it had when I'd been there the day before, the same cold marble exterior, the same sterile atmosphere. But now, there was a feeling about it. A wrongness. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, a sense that something was terribly off. The funeral home was supposed to be closed. But as I walked up to the entrance, I noticed the door was ajar. I hesitated for a moment, but then pushed it open. The smell of incense, the same stale air from yesterday, filled my senses. My heart raced in my chest. I called out, but there was no answer. I made my way down the dim hallway to the chapel where Kevin's body had been the day before. The casket had been closed, but now it was open, empty. The room was empty, the stillness almost suffocating. There was no one there. No funeral director, no staff, just silence. I felt my knees go weak. What the hell was happening? Then, a sound, a creaking, faint, like someone stepping on old wood. I turned, and there he was. Kevin. But this time, he wasn't standing across the street. He was here, in front of me, walking toward me slowly, his eyes vacant, hollow. His face was pale, almost sickly, like something that had been dead for days. His clothes were the same as the ones he'd been buried in, wrinkled, dirty, as though he had crawled out of the grave. "I told you," he rasped, his voice low and hoarse, the same as on the phone. "You shouldn't have come." I backed up, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. "I'm not dead," he repeated, taking another step toward me. "And you're going to wish you hadn't found out." I turned to run, but when I looked over my shoulder, he was gone. Vanished. No trace. Not a single footprint in the dust on the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed out of the chapel, out of the funeral home, gasping for air. I stumbled into the cold night air, feeling like I was going to lose my mind. But when I looked up, standing at the end of the street, was Kevin. Staring at me. Eyes empty. Face expressionless. The same terrifying figure, but this time, he wasn't just watching from a distance. He was waiting. Waiting for me to understand. I couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick, too heavy, pressing against my chest, suffocating me with each panicked gasp. My heart hammered in my ears, my body shaking violently as I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from Kevin. He was still there, standing at the end of the street, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I was certain of one thing, whatever this was, whatever was happening, it wasn't just some twisted prank. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. This was real. Too real. I tried to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could hear my pulse thumping in my throat, my body paralyzed with terror. The streets around me were empty, the buildings silent, as though the world itself had fallen away, leaving only me and this thing, Kevin, who wasn't supposed to be alive. It had to be a mistake. It had to be. But every rational thought I tried to hold on to slipped further from my grasp. I had seen him in the funeral home. I had heard his voice, felt the icy chill in the air when he spoke. He was there, alive in a way that couldn't be explained. And now, here he was, watching me from across the street, his vacant eyes boring into mine with a kind of cold certainty. "Kevin," I managed to whisper, my voice breaking. My throat felt raw, like it was being constricted from the inside. "What do you want?" The wind picked up, swirling around me, tugging at my hair, making my skin crawl. But Kevin didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, motionless, like a statue, except his eyes, those eyes, never left mine. "I told you," he said again, his voice a rasp, distant but clear. "You shouldn't have come." A chill ran through me, sharper than any winter wind. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was stuck, my feet glued to the pavement. It was like I was locked in place, trapped in some horrible trance. I wasn't alone. A feeling of dread settled in my stomach, cold and heavy, as though something was lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim me. I had been a fool, walking into this. But now, it felt like there was no escape. Like I had crossed some invisible line, and now, there was no turning back. "Please," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes, threatening to spill over. "What do you want from me? What did I do wrong?" Kevin took a step forward. I felt it in my gut. He wasn't the same anymore. He wasn't Kevin. Not anymore. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, his voice taking on a strange, echoing quality, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth, far away and impossible to reach. I wanted to scream again, but my voice caught in my throat. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get as far away from him as possible, but I couldn't. He was too close. Closer than I had ever imagined. I could hear his breath now, that same raspy sound, and with every exhale, it felt like the world around me was closing in. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cold. Bone-chilling cold, like a deathly frost had just gripped me from behind. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, only to find nothing. No one. The street was empty. I spun back toward Kevin. He was gone. My heart hammered in my chest, and I couldn't tell if I had just imagined the whole thing. But then I saw it. The same empty, hollow stare. His face. His body. Right there, in front of me. Just standing there, as if he had always been there. I froze. "You shouldn't have come," he said one last time, his voice now coming from all around me, vibrating in my bones. "You never should have come." The ground beneath my feet seemed to tilt, the world spinning around me, everything going blurry. And then, with one last breath, one last step, he reached out for me, his hand, those cold, skeletal fingers, stretching toward me. I felt his touch, as if his fingers were sinking into my skin, dragging me toward him. But I couldn't fight back. My body was like lead, too heavy to move, too tired to resist. All I could do was stare into his eyes. Those empty, lifeless eyes. They seemed to pull me in, swallowing me whole. And then, everything went dark. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. I sat up in bed, heart racing, breath shallow, the nightmare still fresh in my mind. I had to blink several times to make sure I was awake, that it had all been a dream. But the sense of wrongness in the air remained. The chill still clung to me, seeping into my skin, settling deep into my bones. But that wasn't the worst part. No. The worst part was what I saw when I reached for my phone. There was a message. The same number. Kevin's number. "Why did you come back?" it said. "I'm not done with you yet." I felt the blood drain from my face. I had thought I was free. I had hoped that waking up would be the escape I needed. But it wasn't. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as I stared at the screen, I realized the truth. Kevin hadn't been the only one to return from the dead. I had, too. And now, neither of us were ever going to leave.